So this week, a dramatic decision from the Supreme Court striking down the Rwanda policy. This is the UK government's flagship migration policy, essentially. The idea is that asylum seekers would be processed and resettled in Rwanda to deter them from making the journey illegally to the UK. Now, the case hinged on the fact that Rwanda is probably not a safe country. It might send people back to their country of origins, the so-called refoulement being a risk. But Tom, I mean, what have you made of the decision and the sort of political implications of it?
Well, I think since the Rwanda policy was first mooted, it's kind of brought all of the sort of anti-democratic parts of our system out in hives, or the non-democratic part, shall we say. It's been a kind of stress test in a weird sort of way for how supposedly democratic policymaking can function in a situation where the elites are very much against the policy. So regardless of how you feel about Rwanda, and we've criticised it on Spiked, and we might get into that here, but there is something very concerning that from the off, first of all, we had the kind of natural response from the great and good. You had the Lords want to get involved naturally to try and thwart this. You even had King, then Prince Charles, making it known what he felt about the policy. The Archbishop of Canterbury gets involved, and then ultimately it's something which has to be decided and ruled upon in the courts, first in our own courts, but inevitably this battle could end up in Strasbourg as well. And I think it raises really difficult questions about who rules, who decides on policy in this country, as the role of the law just drifted so far into the role of political contestation to the point where you can't separate out the parts. All of that is really, really concerning. At the same time, you couldn't help but feel that partly because of the Tory party's unwillingness to do what it would take to really push a policy like this through, to grasp some of the nettles of the European Court of Human Rights or the Refugee Convention, things that would make them very unpopular on the dinner party set, even if they want the policy. Yeah. The fear of what it might look like to try and implement it is something that obviously deterred them. And that's where a lot of the criticism of Sunak has come from, which is that you have been engaging, as Suella Braverman said, in kind of magical thinking. You thought you could pass a policy that was obviously going to hit these roadblocks with a bit of tinkering around the edges without wanting to really kind of do what is necessary. So I think there's a kind of combination of, yes, it has raised those really disturbing questions as to who rules, who decides policy and so on, but also I think has called the Tories bluff in a sense about how committed they are to this particular policy, to this particular way of governing. And left you with the suggestion that they would rather just kind of be engaged in this constant panto with the courts or the blob or what have you, rather than actually do what they say they want to do, you know? Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, even the Sunak's reaction to this, he's tried to present himself as saying he will do whatever it takes, but on paper, you know, the actual policies he's suggesting, declaring Rwanda a safe country via Parliament, lots of eminent lawyers who are quite trustworthy, like Lord Sumption, have said this is just rubbish. It's not going to, the policy was struck down in so many, at such a fundamental level that you can't really remake it. I mean, Paul, what do you make of that? I mean, it is a problem, isn't it? That essentially it isn't even our government that decides our immigration policy.
It is, but I do think we need to be careful about laying all of the blame for what's happened recently in terms of the Rwanda policy purely at the door of judges. I'm not a legal expert. I haven't read the judgment. I've seen the reports of it. I do think the idea, as Jonathan Sumption said, of simply legislating to say that Rwanda is a safe country when a court has, on the basis of the facts, said it isn't, is bizarre, to be honest. Whatever your view on the substantive issue, passing a law saying a country is safe just seems to me to be a bit ridiculous. But the point I was going to make is that the danger of laying the blame at the door of judges is it allows politicians off the hook for what has been a consistent and monumental policy failure over a number of years now. And I suspect that the Tories would like to see everybody kind of rising up against the judiciary and the civil service. And I'm not saying that those elements are blameless, especially the civil service, I have to say. But it will be seen by more astute people as an attempt to deflect the blame, really. And when you think that this government, the Tory government, has over many years, time and again, year after year, election after election, manifesto after manifesto, said we understand the concerns about uncontrolled immigration, the levels of uncontrolled immigration, the rate and the pace, and we will get the numbers down. And time and again, They completely failed to do it. And you have to conclude, not just because they're inept, but because probably, and this goes back to the debate about, the liberal Tories, many of them, and actually I think many of them favour a kind of liberal immigration policy for all sorts of reasons. So we have to pin that on them, and we have to make it clear that those are the people who ultimately are to blame for it. We have to break the business model. There's no doubt on the wider issue that sees thousands of people try every year, risk their lives in order to come to Britain, often, because they've paid large amounts of money to traffic as criminals. That model, clearly has to be broken. And interestingly, I think the Supreme Court did confirm effectively that an offshore policy isn't of itself necessarily unlawful. So it's still a runner, but there are obviously huge hurdles that need to be overcome. But I just think on the wider issue, it isn't callous and it isn't heartless, and it isn't reactionary to say, look, no self-respecting country can have a situation where thousands of undocumented young men, because it is mainly young men, are just arriving on our shores, every year, and we essentially can't really do anything about it. That is a serious issue. It's a serious concern for people. And until government gets a grip of it, then it's going to continue to be a running sore in our society. It was a real tragedy in many respects, because it was almost as if we'd put that issue to bed, really, in the 1990s, after you'd see the rise of the National Front in the 1970s and some of the racial tensions then. Because people felt that the system was being managed fairly effectively, it kind of disappeared as a mainstream issue at election time. Because of all the things that have happened since, it's come back to the fore. And I think that's a crying shame in many respects.
Tom?
No, I think actually tacking onto that is that it's a prerequisite for maintaining support for immigration that you get on top of the small boats issue. If the people do not feel like there is any kind of sense of control, that no one's in charge, you need to know who is in your country. You need to know who is entering. This is as much of a numbers question, but it's also a security question. There's all these things that are obviously fundamental to a state's ability just to kind of maintain support even for some of its other policies in relation to immigration. It's so fundamental. So the people who just kind of dismiss it out of hand and act as if it's something that's been magicked out of nowhere, that, oh, this is trivial, this doesn't really matter, I think are going to regret saying that and regret making those deflections, because of the fact that in periods in which, as Paul says, people feel like things are under control, it's a bit like immediately after Brexit, you did see a softening of concerns about immigration. People still wanted numbers to come down, broadly speaking, but it was less high up their kind of lists of priorities, even amongst Leavers as well as Remainers, because people assume that, right, we're getting this new system, it's going to be something which is controlled, it's something that we're going to be able to have control over, and therefore it falls down the list of priorities, people are less concerned about it. Then again, as soon as you get a situation like small boats crisis, it completely shatters any of that trust. So I think it's a prerequisite of a more liberal immigration policy, or even just support for migration in general, for this to be dealt with. I'm surprised that more people on the more liberal side of this argument don't recognise that they're kind of wrecking their own argument.
One of the great lies, just briefly, one of the great lies during the Brexit campaign was that all Leave voters were kind of anti-immigration and they didn't like immigrants and they wanted to send all immigrants back. It was absolutely false. And anyone who mixed with Leave voters knew that for the most part it was false. And in fact, I think it was shortly after the Brexit referendum, the Sunday Times did a poll where they asked, should people from the EU who were already in Britain prior to Brexit be allowed to stay? And I think it was around 79% of Leave voters said yes. So the idea that they were all kind of, anti-immigrant, send them all back, was just an absolute myth, and one that sadly was allowed to develop.
Yeah, and it does seem strange to me that it does seem like a new thing in liberal opinion. I'm sure it wasn't like this 10 years ago, and certainly, the new Labour government wouldn't have said anything like this, but it seems like people's support for illegal immigration is very odd. Suddenly, as you suggested, it's callous to even deal with irregular migration, to tackle organised crime that is responsible for bringing people over the border.
Well, it wasn't that long ago that on the left, the position of controlling your borders, controlling the labour supply, was a mainstream position on the left, because people, trade union leaders, working class Labour MPs, understood that the labour supply was a market dynamic, which, like all market dynamics, needed to be regulated so as to allow the government to plan around employment and welfare and housing and to make sure there wasn't undue pressure on wages and stuff. Entirely mainstream position on the left. And the open borders position was largely a position that was held by, Trotskyists, anarchists, and hyperliberals. And now that's kind of completely crumbled, that particular consensus, if you like, where the vast majority of the left, in my view, are in favour of a very liberal immigration policy. And anyone who kind of tries to articulate the more traditional position of controlling the labour supply is looked upon as some sort of fan of Nigel Farage. You must be some rabid right-winger. I mean, that's how far away from I think sensible politics the left has gone in recent years.